Well, as I mentioned in my editorial there, Anthony Albanese's plan to trade his credibility in the hope he might woo voters with Labor's revised tax cuts. Well, that's fallen flat in today's Newspoll. For more, and I'm delighted to say he's back for 2024, I'm joined now by National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Well, we've missed you here on Credlin, Dennis. Great to have you back as Parliament kicks off for the year. Give us your sense. This is a major election promise. Not a couple of times, he said it, over 100 times. My word is my bond, all of that. The prize for Australians is around $15 a week back from July. And all the PM's got here for shredding his credibility is this 1-point bump in the polls. Give us your take on what's really been a momentous start to this year, hasn't it?
Well, it certainly has been a momentous start. And Anthony Albanese started his political year about the middle of December. It was clear that the Prime Minister was aware of falling public support and the need to actually do something about cost of living relief for Middle Australia. He campaigned like an election campaign, travelling the country, giving press releases and interviews all over the place. And what he did promise first up in his first press conference was that there would be cost of living relief in the budget. Then he announced that there would in fact be a rewriting of the stage 3 tax cuts, a completely broken promise, one that he'd pledged a number of times, one that he clearly misled people about, and which he completely overturned, and which is now the whole point of the parliamentary sitting this week. So what he has done here is he has decided he had to be seen to be doing something. He was afraid of spending too much money and fueling inflation, so he has conflated the tax cuts with addressing inflation, and he's now broken a promise that he's made a number of times, and also in a fairly dodgy way misled the public and everyone else about his intentions. But what the Newspoll has shown today is that more than 2/3 of people have said, well, they think it's about the right thing to do because it's going to give more help to people on lower incomes. And look, I think given that there was virtually no change, it's essentially the same Newspoll on all the numbers that it was in December last year, that while it's not a bump at all, but I think something that Labor would be pleased about, because what they were looking at and what Anthony Albanese was afraid of was actually a further fall in the polls at the beginning of this year, and that could have led him down a losing trajectory, as it did for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. So I think that Labor will be pleased at least with no change in the polls, but it has cost an enormous amount for Anthony Albanese's credibility, for some of the taxpayers, and also for the long-term strategy which the coalition will exploit.
And I would argue, as I did at the top of the show, I mean, that's actually the blood price they've paid. Are they happy to have paid that price? Well, we'll see in the coming news polls. But, I mean, once you shred the PM's credibility, very hard to get that back. And it means, forget this promise, every other promise from here on in will have voters questioning, am I actually going to see it? Do they really mean it? And I like you saying that this all started in December, because you must have been watching a Treasury committee debates today, as I was. I mean, Jane Hume really went after the Treasury officials. It was revealed, of course, that these tax cuts were reworked in December last year. Labor, you remember, going into Christmas, had that horror couple of weeks of the Parliament over all those detainees released. I mean, it was just like Keystone Cop sort of stuff. So they started on this in December, yet we have the Prime Minister, as recently, I think, about the 14th of January, out there saying, no, back them in, not going to change, I'll deliver them. This is what voters hate to see, this sort of planned duplicity.
Well, indeed, and it is duplicitous, and it is clear from what the Prime Minister and the Treasurer were saying publicly that what Treasury was doing was something else completely different. That Treasury, today we hear from the Senate Estimates Committees, and as well the timeline says it all, that this huge tax reform And this is stage 3 of the tax reform that began first in 2018. And all of a sudden, in just a couple of weeks, Treasury is able to rework it completely. And in a couple of days, the government is able to accept this surprise advice from the Treasury and say, yes, get it done and dusted through the Cabinet, through the caucus, through the Expenditure Review Committee, and announce it. And here we have Parliament ready to look at it tomorrow. So it is an extraordinarily misleading behaviour from the government. And of course, they're trying to push it back onto the Liberals and say, oh no, circumstances changed and we had to make a hard decision. This hasn't been a hard decision. It's not a hard decision to give a whole lot of people extra money. That's an easy decision to make. The hard decision is actually to try and keep down spending and create savings to actually finance those tax cuts, as well as including a $28 billion benefit from bracket creep over the next 10 years. I mean, to describe this as reform or anything else is a nonsense.
ASIC reports today there's about 3,000 businesses that went bust in the December quarter, and that's significant. Construction, predominantly, hospitality, retail. The building giant today, we learned St Hilliers, it went into administration. There is concern, you know, when you talk about tax cuts, sure, there's small and medium-term businesses out there now, scaled businesses, heavy employers of Australians, doing it really tough. We can see that in the stats. So the government spends about $500,000 to get all the MPs, the Labor MPs, to Canberra during January for that caucus summit and cost of living. Now, if you're in a pub tonight, your beer's a little bit more expensive. You're going to fill up the car tomorrow and you're going to pay almost 50% now in tax to the government per litre of fuel. You've got to ask yourself, when they all came to Canberra in January and had this cost of living summit, why wasn't something like this automatic indexation of excise in these areas, why wasn't that on the table, Dennis? Because remember when John Howard was in trouble, 2001 I think it was, Aston by-election about this time in the year, he did something about petrol indexation. It saved him in Aston and it also helped him win later on the year in the general election. We know there's a Dunkley by-election around the corner. I think they're bleeding on these sorts of genuine cost of living, at the till, at the Bowser sort of issues. They're not going to see much from these tax cuts, and they are months away.
Well, indeed. And look, the so-called cost of living summit was a charade. It was there to lock in the rest of the Labor with the decision by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to change the tax cuts. That's all it was about. It was like locking them in on the voice to Parliament. They are all now one. There can be no critics. They are locked in. And what else did they look at? Did they look at the cost of energy, the real driving cost for businesses, which is driving people to the wall? Increasingly, we are going to see more and more businesses, particularly restaurants and people in the hospitality areas, going to the wall because, well, yes, inflation has started to slow down. Good news. But there's a lag of months, up to 12 months, while we'll see building construction firms and others go under. And yet at that cost of living summit, all they did was tick the change to the tax, stage 3 tax cuts, and they didn't address all of the other issues, including petrol, power, all these other forces on inflation and the cost of living, not a word. All we heard was, yes, we've changed the Scott Morrison tax cuts.